Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Devil's Pleasure Palace, The Cult of Critical Theory, and the Subversion of the West, by Michael Walsh. Narrated by Michael Walsh. For Anne Patricia Walsh, my mother, who taught me to love words. Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Marx, Thesis on Feuerbach. But I can't listen to music often. It affects the nerves. One wants to say pleasant stupidities and stroke on the head the people who, living in this dirty hell, can create such beauty. And today it is impossible to stroke anyone on the head. They bite off your hand, and it is necessary to beat heads, beat them ruthlessly, although we, ideally, are against any sort of violence against people. The task is diabolically difficult. Vladimir Lenin, as recounted by Maxim Gorky in Days with Lenin. Only a humanity to which death has become as indifferent as its members, which has died to itself, can inflict it administratively on innumerable people. Theodor Adorno, Minima Moralia, Reflections on a Damaged Life. You can discover what your enemy fears most by observing the means he uses to frighten you. Take away hatred from some people, and you have men without faith. Erich Hoffer, The Passionate State of Mind. It is true that storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it, that it brings about consent and reconciliation with things as they really are, and that we may even trust it to contain eventually, by implication, that last word which we expect from the Day of Judgment. Hannah Arendt, Men in Dark Times. At the core of liberalism is the spoiled child, miserable, as all spoiled children are, unsatisfied, demanding, ill-disciplined, despotic, and useless. Liberalism is a philosophy of sniveling brats. P.J. O'Rourke, Give War a Chance. The champions of socialism call themselves progressives, but they recommend a system which is characterized by rigid observance of routine and by a resistance to every kind of improvement. They call themselves liberals, but they are intent upon abolishing liberty. They call themselves Democrats, but they yearn for dictatorship. They call themselves revolutionaries, but they want to make the government omnipotent. They promise the blessings of the Garden of Eden, but they plan to transform the world into a gigantic post office. Every man but one a subordinate clerk in a bureau. What an alluring utopia! What a noble cause to fight for! Ludwig von Mises, Bureaucracy. The crisis of the West consists in the West's having become uncertain of its purpose. Leo Strauss, The City and Man. Preface. The Argument. In the aftermath of World War II, America, the new leader of the West, stood alone as the world's premier military power. Yet its martial confidence contrasted vividly with its sense of cultural inferiority. Still looking to a defeated and dispirited Europe for intellectual and artistic guidance, a burgeoning transnational elite in New York City and Washington, D.C., embraced not only the war's refugees, but also many of their resolutely 19th-century modern ideas as well. Few, if any, of these ideas have proven more pernicious than those of the so-called Frankfurt School and its reactionary philosophy of critical theory. At once overly intellectualized and emotionally juvenile, critical theory, like Pandora's box, released a horde of demons into the American psyche. When everything could be questioned, nothing could be real, and the muscular, confident empiricism that had just won the war gave way in less than a generation to a fashionable Central European nihilism that was celebrated on college campuses across the United States. Seizing the high ground of academe and the arts, the new nihilists set about dissolving the bedrock of the country, from patriotism to marriage to the family to military service. They have sown, as Cardinal Bergoglio, now Pope Francis, has written of Satan, who will play a large role in our story, destruction, division, hatred, and calumny, and all disguised as a search for truth that will lead to human happiness here on earth. Of course, what has resulted is something far from that. Were any of the originators of critical theory still among us, they might well say, quoting Sir Christopher Wren, "Si monumentum requiris circumspice." Look about your daily lives here in the early 21st century America and Western Europe and see the shabbiness, hear the coarseness of speech and dialogue, witness the lowered standards not only of personal behavior but also of cultural norms, savor the shrunken horizons of the future. The Frankfurt School sucker-punched American culture right in its weak solar plexus. Americans have always been sympathetic to an alternative point of view, sympathetic to the underdog, solicitous of strangers, especially foreign refugees fleeing a monster like Hitler. Largely innocent of the European battles over various forms of socialism, and softened up to a certain extent by the Roosevelt administration's early, frank admiration of Mussolini as it tried to solve the economic crisis of the Depression, the American public was open to self-criticism. The problem with the Frankfurt School scholars was that they arrived with ideological blinders, men of the left fighting other men of the left back in the old Heimat, and were unable to see that there was another, different world welcoming them in the United States if only they would open their eyes. How, for example, could they hate California? They appear not so much scholarly as simple, viewing American capitalism as a vast, deliberate conspiracy against their own socialist ideas, when in fact their ideas were simply wrong, their analysis flawed, and their animus ineradicable. They were creatures of their own time and place, with no more claim to absolute truth than the man on a soapbox in Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, or the lunatic staggering down Market Street in San Francisco talking to himself. Everybody's got a beef. One thing they did get right, though. Popular culture lay at the heart of the American experience. It was hugely influential in a way that surpassed the understanding of European academics. Without official sanction, it spoke for the people in a way that state-sponsored socialist realist art never could. They knew pop culture was potent, very potent, but they had no idea how to create more of it or control it. They were so obsessed with their crude and unsophisticated Marxism, so devoted to their paradigm of the class struggle, that they worried about pop culture's destructive top-down effect on the gullible proletariat, and viewed Hollywood and the mass media as, naturally, a capitalist plot to seduce the rubes. Seduction, they believed, was their socialist birthright, not capitalism's. They desired self-improving, consciousness-raising art to be a matter for the state, and they disdained the profit motive, though they certainly had no objection to making money. But their successors had no such quibbles with mass culture. They grasped that the long march through the institutions, as the Marxists characterized it, would be the ticket to ideological hegemony and even greater wealth, evolution, not revolution. This is a book about how we got here. It's also a book about good and evil, about creation and destruction, about capitalism and socialism, about God, Satan, and the satanic in men, about myths and legends and the truths within them, about culture versus politics, about the difference between story and plot. It is about Milton versus Marx, the United States versus Germany, about redemptive truth versus Mephistophelan bands of illusion and the devil's jokes. It concerns itself with the interrelation of culture, religion, sex, and politics. In other words, something herein to offend nearly everybody. And I hope to inspire. For the taboos of our culture are also its totems, and the political arguments that rage around them are symptomatic of both disease and good health, of infection and immunity. They are not simply battlefields in the larger contemporary culture war. They are the culture war, a war that has been raging since the Garden of Eden, but that manifests itself today in the unceasing attack of cultural Marxism, which molts and masquerades under many names, including liberalism, progressivism, social justice, environmentalism, anti-racism, etc., upon what used to be called the Christian West. Although this battle is simply the latest front in an ancient war, this critical struggle, the fight, or the struggle, or der Kampf, as the leftists call it, is the defining issue of our time. It will determine not only what kind of country the United States of America will become, but also whether the Western world will continue the moral, cultural, and technological dominance it shares with the larger Anglophone world. or whether it will finally succumb to a relentless assault on its values and accept the loss of its cultural vigor. In other words, will we, repel the invaders, organize sorties, ride out and crush them, or wearily open the gates to the citadel and await the inevitable slaughter? The aggressors include the Frankfurt School of mostly German Marxist philosophers, theoreticians, and writers, as well as their intellectual descendants and acolytes in the U.S., including the followers of Saul Alinsky, the Marxist community organizer, whose influence has only waxed in the years since his death in 1972 and has extended even to the Oval Office. Throughout, I refer to this cabal as the unholy left, a term unapologetically both descriptive and judgmental. It is a term I suspect they would dearly like to embrace but can't quite bring themselves to yet, if only for electoral reasons. I'm not talking of garden-variety liberals, actually big government statists so long as that big government does not come down on them, who see Washington as a kind of taxpayer-funded supra-charity, dispensing goodies to the deserving poor and making sure chemicals aren't dumped in the drinking water. Rather, I refer to the hard left, the radicals, many of whom are now in power, who would remake, fundamentally transform, wreck the United States of America and by extension the civilization of the West. On the other side are not conservatives per se, but those who see themselves in the role of conservators, preservers of the Western legacy, who recognize that we should not lightly abandon a long shared cultural tradition that, whatever its real or perceived faults, has been the primary engine of human moral, spiritual, social, scientific, and medical progress. Therefore, I propose to look at the history of the left-right conflict, to put it in its simplest terms, not only in terms of politics, but in terms of art and culture as well. If the Paleolithic cavemen who painted the walls of Lascaux kept precise, detailed, written astronomical records, we don't know about them. But their symbols and images of animals and people, left on the walls of ancient caves in France, might well contain astronomic information, preserved via the medium of art. Via their paintings, they left us a nearly indelible image of their world. Looking at the vivid illustrations of bulls, stags, and horses, and even other human beings, we can begin to understand who we are in a way that science cannot teach us. The cave paintings are not only evidence, they are human interpretations of evidence, part of our shared heritage. Their artists were who we still are today. They are trying to tell us something. Similarly, the worldview of the ancient Greeks comes down via the medium of poetry and oral narrative, later preserved in written form, and this slender reed of happenstance, subject to the vagaries of selection and preservation, is, together with Jerusalem, one of the pillars upon which rests the entire edifice of Western civilization. Legends they seem to us, but like the cave paintings, they are interpretations of phenomena, internalized by the artists and then re-externalized in the form of narrative, our ur-narrative, or founding myth, from which all that is human in our society flows. We ignore the philosophical and moral significance of this patrimony at our peril and should never dismiss it as mere superstition or storytelling, somehow inferior to the philosophy of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. The writings are all of a piece, clues to our essence, messages in sacred bottles washed ashore upon the sands of time. They are stories of gods and goddesses and titans, but mostly they are stories of heroes. Humanity is inconceivable without heroes. We are not egalitarian members of an ant farm, shuttling from cradle to grave, indistinguishable from one another and easily replaceable. Not everyone can be a hero, but everyone can dream of heroism. Bravery has always been a cardinal human virtue, so great that it was embodied by none other than Jesus Christ, another foundational cultural pillar of the West. In his book, Christ, A Crisis in the Life of God, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Jack Miles looks at the story of Jesus of Nazareth as the tale of the hero of the New Testament, complete with the happy ending of the resurrection. As Miles writes in his prologue, "All mankind is forgiven, but the Lord must die. This is the revolutionary import of the epilogue that 2,000 years ago a group of radical Jewish writers appended to the sacred scripture of their religion. Because they did so, millions in the West today worship before the image of a deity executed as a criminal. And, no less important, other millions who never worship at all carry within their cultural DNA a religiously derived suspicion that somehow, someday, the last will be first and the first last. Matthew chapter 20, verse 16. The humbly heroic Christ, born into straitened circumstances of a virgin mother, a precocious teacher and rabbi who undertook a brief 3-year ministry that was both populist and political, who was captured through treachery, unfairly tried, tortured, and executed, and who returned in triumph over death, is the archetypal Christian hero, supplanting the Homeric heroes, Achilles, Odysseus, who did not give their lives for something larger than themselves, their families, or their tribes. But Christ, the Lamb of God, the Redeemer, Messiah, willingly fails in order to succeed, bestowing a gift upon a humanity that is still not sure whether it wants to accept it. His story, what used to be unapologetically called the greatest story ever told, resonates down through 2,000 years of Western history, touching nearly every major subsequent tale of heroism, from the Chanson de Roland to The Little Mermaid. For what we, in an increasingly secular West, misread as a political argument is, in reality, nothing of the sort. It is a literary argument, if we define literature properly, not as fiction, but as the expression of the soul of a people, in this case, of all people. Politics, which for many has come to replace sports as the subject of rooting interest par excellence, is merely its secondary manifestation, the generally tiresome litany of regurgitated policy prescriptions and bogus campaign promises that residents of the Western democracies routinely encounter today. But where once in our culture raged religious arguments, whose moral underpinnings were never in doubt, today we are concerned not simply with the details of a system of governance and social organization, but with the very nature of that system itself. In fact, at issue is the essence of Western civilization, and how it may be subverted to achieve a vastly different, indeed opposite end than originally intended. For one side has changed the meaning of the principal words in the debate, including democracy, culture, civilization, and justice, among others. The two sides speak different languages, but with a superficially shared vocabulary that serves as a means of deceit for one and confusion for the other. Seduction, subversion, sedition, these are the tools of a creature we once called Satan, the father of lies, the loser of the battle in heaven. Yet he continues the fight here on earth with the only weapons at his disposal: man's inherent weaknesses and zeal to be duped if the cause seems appealing enough. Chief among the weaknesses of Western man today are his fundamental lack of cultural self-confidence, his willingness to open his ears to the siren song of nihilism, a juvenile eagerness to believe the worst about himself and his society, and to relish, on some level, his own prospective destruction. Whether one views the combatants in the struggle between God and Satan ontologically, mythically, or literarily, God created man in his own image and likeness, but chose to give him free will, a force so powerful that not even God's infinite love can always overcome it. Thus, given a sporting chance to ruin God's favorites, the fallen light-bringer, Lucifer, picked himself and his fellows off the floor of the fiery lake into which they were plunged by the sword of St. Michael, and he endeavors each day not to conquer man but to seduce and destroy him. As Satan observes in Book 1 of Milton's Paradise Lost, "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. What matter where, if I be still the same? To reign is worth ambition though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." Satan himself, however, has no need for servants in hell as God does in heaven. He is instead satisfied with corpses on earth. As modern history shows, the devil has had great success and ample reward in that department. But he cannot be satisfied with his infernal kingdom. As in a Hollywood sequel, the body count must be ever higher just to keep the antagonist interested. Damnation consists not in consignment to the netherworld, but in the rejection of the narrative, a willful separation of oneself from the heroic path for which history provides a clear signpost. As Milton writes in the Areopagitica, the poet's seminal essay on freedom of speech and, more important, freedom of thought, "I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue, unexercised and unbreathed, that never sallies out and sees her adversary, but slinks out of the race where that immortal garland is to be run for, not without dust and heat." For Milton, the very absence of conflict was in itself contemptible, unmanly, inhuman. This eternal conflict, then, is the essence of my religio-cultural argument, which I will view through the triple prisms of 1. Atheist cultural Marxism that sprang up amid the physical and intellectual detritus of Europe after the calamity of World War I, and its practical battering ram application, critical theory. And 2. The Book of Genesis, from which our cultural self-understanding flows, and Milton's great explicative epic poem in which a god who reigns supreme is also a strangely absent and largely offstage prime mover, and 3. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's emblematic reworking of the man caught in the middle between heaven and hell, between God and Mephistopheles, Faust. It is the story of humanity's journey, of roads taken and not taken, and about the choices we must make. Let us begin, then, in hell. Introduction of The Devil's Pleasure Palace. In 1813, the 16-year-old Viennese composer Franz Peter Schubert began work on his first opera, Des Teufels Lustschloss, The Devil's Pleasure Palace, with a libretto by August von Kotzebue. The work remained unperformed until 1978, when it was finally staged in Potsdam, outside of Berlin. To say that Schubert was young when he composed this youthful but culturally seminal work partially obscures that he also proved middle-aged, dying at 31 in 1828. People got older younger then, grew up faster, perhaps lived life more fully. In any case, the creative force embodied by Schubert was in a hurry to meet its negation, which is to say, its completion. In Des Teufels Lustschloss, Oswald, a poor knight, marries Luitgarde, an aristocrat's niece, who is promptly disinherited. Heading for a new life, they are caught in a raging storm and take refuge in a nearby inn. When superstitious villagers tell of a strange, haunted castle in the vicinity, Oswald and his faithful squire Robert set off to investigate the manor house, which indeed turns out to be bristling with terrors and temptations. One of the latter takes the form of a shapely Amazon, who tries to seduce Oswald, warning him of dire consequences should he not succumb. He does not. The more adamantly faithful Oswald is, though, the more terrors rise up to threaten him. He is finally saved by the timely arrival of Luitgarde, who, when threatened with death herself, stands fast, and suddenly the castle crumbles. In the end, it all turns out to have been an illusion. The spirits were the villagers in disguise, hired by Luitgarde's uncle to test Oswald's courage under fire and prove him worthy of Luitgarde. Conventional musical wisdom has long held that Kotzebue's libretto is the principal reason for the opera's neglect, an explanation applied to all Schubert operas as it happens. More likely, the cause is Schubert's inexpert handling of the dramatic necessities inherent in operatic composition. What works so brilliantly for him in songs and song cycles failed him as a composer in the larger forms of vocal compositions, although curiously not in his symphonies, each of which grew in sophistication and scope. But, seen in another light, Kotzebue's work is entirely in line with European philosophical thought of the time as expressed through art. Recall that this is the early 19th century, not the 20th. The horrors of 1914 and 1939 are still far in the future. The happy ending, a victory of love over death, is not a cop-out, but the proof of the promise of redemption, that we must suffer the temptations and travails of Christ and face our worst fears in order to win in the end. That its conclusion, and then I woke up and it was all a dream, has since become a groan-worthy cliché is not Kotzebue's fault, given that he wrote in a less cynical age. But anyone ever tempted to throw a shoe at the end of Fritz Lang's 1944 film noir The Woman in the Window knows what I mean, not to mention Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And who represents the saving power of divine grace? Almost invariably the woman, whose own self-sacrifice rescues and transfigures the flawed male hero. In Goethe's famous words from the second part of Faust, Das ewig Weibliche zieht uns hinan, or the eternal feminine draws us onward. The eternal feminine, a sexually anti-egalitarian concept that feminists of both sexes today would regard as laughable, is one of the organizing principles of the cosmos and a crucial factor in the hero's journey. Even the pansexuality of today, try though it might, cannot replace this naturally primal force, the union of opposites into a harmonious, generative whole. Crucially, then, Oswald is saved by the love of a good woman. So is the Flying Dutchman in Wagner's opera. So is Robert le Diable in Meyerbeer's opera of the same name. So is Max, the Freischütz, in Weber's masterpiece. And so, in another Wagner work, is Parsifal, whose sexual rejection of Kundry, the Magdalene figure, and her alluring flower maidens ultimately releases Kundry from Klingsor's curse. Without her compelled attempt at seduction, Parsifal could never have found strength through sexual sublimation, a potency that allows him to conquer the evil magician and regain the spear, thus causing Klingsor's own infernal pleasure palace to crumble into dust. In short, in these tales, the 20th century cynicism of the interwar generation does not yet hold sway in the larger culture. The age of anxiety, alienation, nihilism, and ennui still lies in the future, but it will come, creating along the way its own secular Xanadu, another poetic Lustschloss, to tempt and seduce Western civilization into self-destruction, with shame and self-doubt its principal snares. 2 years after this ambitious but abortive effort, Schubert wrote the song that made his reputation, Erlkönig, based on a text by Goethe. The hammering octaves and rolling bass line in the piano would later inspire silent movie pianists around the world, but they perfectly express the song's terrifying tale of a desperate father, his deathly ill son in his arms, riding furiously on horseback to bring the boy to safety, and chased by the Erlkönig, the elf king, the figure of death, who sings beguilingly to the boy in a voice that only the child can hear. Du liebes Kind, komm, geh mit mir. Gar schöner Spieler spiel ich mit dir. Manch bunter Blumen sind an dem Strand. Meine Mutter hat manch gülden Gewand. Darling child, come away with me. Such beautiful games I can play with you. So many colorful flowers on the beach. My mother has many a golden robe. The music grows in intensity as the father speeds for safety, but Death's seductive song is faster, his blandishments richer, and the boy is so desirable. The child cries that the elf king has grabbed him. The anguished father arrives at his destination, and in seinem Armen das Kind war tot. In his arms, the child was dead. In one stroke of youthful genius, romanticism in music had begun. Des Teufels Lustschloss may never have found its place in the operatic repertory, nor has any other Schubert stage work. It is important, nevertheless, for what it tells us about the state of European theatrical thinking at the beginning of the philosophically tumultuous watershed 19th century. What the taste of the audience was, and what effect the work had upon later generations of creative artists. A straight line runs from the penultimate sequence of Mozart's Don Giovanni, with its whiff of the diabolical, and the entirety of the Magic Flute, with its battle between good and evil, through Schubert's youthful works, to Meyerbeer's Parisian spectacular Robert le Diable, and Marschner's supernatural Hans Heiling, and ahead to the spooky German landscapes of Carl Maria von Weber's Der Freischütz, the haunted seacoast of Wagner's Flying Dutchman, and right through to the end of Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung cycle, which is to say, the end of the world. Or, to put it another way, these operas convey mankind's innate desire to come face to face with the hidden forces behind our origins, good and evil, heaven and hell, God and Satan. From this primal conflict emerges our yearning for dramatic narrative and the daemonic in art. Daemonic in the sense of uncanny or supernatural. Signposts pointing the way toward a meaning of life that science, which rejects the daemonic, cannot provide, if only we pay attention and follow where they lead. The more the hero tries to avoid his fate, the more it rushes toward him. This paradox is the dilemma of modern Western man emerging from the abattoir of the 20th century's battlefields, understandably shell-shocked and conflict-averse. And it is also one of the central themes of every tale from Gilgamesh to Disney's animated version of Tarzan. Only by embracing his doom, to use the old English word, and facing down his greatest fears, fears far more terrifying than the actual combat will eventually prove, can he overcome his broken humanity and become godlike. We like to think that, as Aristotle teaches in his doctrine of mimesis, art imitates life, that our all-too-human creations of drama, poetry, theater, and literature are reflections of the human condition.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?